Good day. Yesterday, in my video, I discussed at some length the disastrous address, or rather press conference of President Macron of France, in which it was obvious, at least to me, that he was rowing back on his original plan to announce a deployment of French troops to Ukraine. It's quite obvious to me that that had been his original intention. He'd been working up to that pitch over the previous weeks, and this was, I'm sure, what was coming. But at the end, following strong warnings from President Putin about the Russian reaction and clear signs of opposition from France's Western allies, Germany, the United States, and Britain, Macron backed down and spoke about how deploying troops to Ukraine was something that should not be ruled out, but also made it clear that he did not, for the moment, intend to deploy troops to Ukraine, and that France would not be the first to make that decision. Well, over the course of that program yesterday, I also touched on the fact that directly after this press conference, Macron was off to Berlin to meet with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, and rather curiously, the Prime Minister of Poland, Donald Tusk, was also on his way to Berlin to attend the meeting there. And I was somewhat uncertain quite why that would be so, but I suggested that perhaps, given the strong opposition from Berlin to Macron's proposals, that it was most likely that the Germans were going to tell Macron to his face that he needed to back off this plan of his to deploy troops to Ukraine. And, well, we've been getting reports since then dribbling out from the European media, including primarily, I should say, the Financial Times, which appear to confirm that. The reports suggest that the purpose of the meeting between Macron and Scholz is to try to smooth over their differences, to present to the rest of Europe and to the world a united front by the European Union's two leading countries, and to try to do something to repair what has been the collapsing relationship between Scholz and Macron. And supposedly, Donald Tusk's coming to Berlin is intended to facilitate this reconciliation. Before he was re-elected Prime Minister of Poland, for a certain period of time, for a long period of time, Donald Tusk was European Council President, which of course meant that he got to know people in Germany and people in Poland, including Macron himself and probably Olaf Scholz quite well. So on that basis, he appears to be the obvious person, or at least an obvious person, to effect such a reconciliation. And it does seem as if this is the primary purpose of this exercise. The Germans, as I think I mentioned in yesterday's program, have been taking further steps, which suggests that they too are starting to back away from Project Ukraine. The Bundestag has again voted, this is the third vote in the series, against the supply of Taurus missiles to Ukraine. For the moment, it does look as if that plan is off the agenda. There was massive embarrassment in Berlin following Russia's release of the recording of the conversation between senior German officers about the supply of Taurus missiles to Ukraine and the role that the Germans might take in their use. And it does seem as if the Germans, having looked over the abyss, are now taking a step back, and they're making it very clear to Macron that with Germany having taken that step back, it doesn't want Macron coming along and pulling them over the edge into the abyss with him. So, for the moment, we can perhaps breathe a little bit more easily. It looks as if the first steps towards a possible armed confrontation between NATO and Russia over Ukraine, it looks as if the first open confrontation of that nature has been called off. However, we mustn't relax too much. Lots of things could still happen to throw everything into chaos and war and destruction. I've received a whole lot of further information about the nuclear facility, the nuclear weapons facility in Belgorod region, which I understand was the prime target of the Ukrainians in their attacks on that region. At least this is what one extremely reliable source, well-informed source has told me. And by the way, I should say it's been, in effect, confirmed by yet another source. Well, over my last two programs, I've expressed dismay at the fact that there are nuclear weapons stored in a facility so close to the contact line. I wondered whether they could possibly still be there. The original source that informed me about the fact that this facility was the Ukrainians' primary target has now come back. He's provided a lot of information about this facility. Again, I'm not going to go into the details of the information he's provided because, again, I do wonder whether that might reveal to various people who might be watching this program more about who he is. But anyway, the long and the short of it is that there are nuclear weapons still stored in that facility. I've been provided with a number, which is substantial. I've been given an explanation of how powerful these weapons are, what their yield is, and that information is also alarming. I've been told about the security systems around this base, which do in truth seem to be substantial. It looks as if there's a significant body of security guards stationed around this base, and perhaps more importantly, and this must be well known to all involved governments, there's a motorized rifle brigade, apparently of the Russian army, apparently located within 15 minutes distance of this facility. So it does look as if this facility is very powerfully guarded indeed by a force, if it's a full-strength brigade, which I presume it is, a force which is arguably stronger than the forces Ukraine used to launch its attempts to penetrate the border. I will come to all that shortly. But anyway, it seems that this facility does exist. In fact, it doesn't seem. This facility does exist. Nuclear weapons are stored there. I know the number. I know the yield. I know a little bit about the security precautions around the base. And apparently this was the Ukrainian objective, to try to seize this facility. And apparently this is the second attempt they've made to do it. They tried to do the same thing during the attacks that they launched in this same area last year, though the attacks in this case do appear to be of a much more determined and extensive nature. We will come to that in a moment. So, very alarming development. And again, I have to say, I do wonder what Western governments, who must understand what the Ukrainians were trying to do, what Western governments make of this. And I'm going to make a guess that not for the first time, there's been a division between the governments, the political leaders, and the military in the West, and perhaps other officials in the bureaucracies. I suspect that the militaries in the West, first and foremost the United States military, must be deeply alarmed by this development. And I wonder whether they haven't been communicating their disapproval both to the Ukrainians themselves and to those Western governments that have been lending support to Ukraine, including conceivably their own. I say that because I cannot imagine that the Pentagon would be happy to see the Ukrainians gain control of nuclear weapons in this way, and presumably threaten to use them, though whether they could, I really am not in a position to say. But that leads me to some rather intriguing thoughts. Firstly, John Helmer, intrepid and insightful and extremely well-informed reporter of Russian affairs that he is saying that the Russian media, or at least parts of the Russian media, have been claiming that the recording of the discussions between the German officers talking about the strike, the Taurus missile strike on the Kerch Bridge, that the Russian media has been saying, or at least some parts of the Russian media have been saying, that this recording was actually provided to the Russians by the US Air Force, that the US Air Force is becoming extremely alarmed by all of these developments, wants to distance itself from them, is very alarmed about what the Germans were up to, presumably was unhappy at the fact that officials of the US government were perhaps complicit in this plan to use Taurus missiles and German personnel to strike at the Kerch Bridge and at targets further east in Russia itself, or at least in pre-2014 Russia, and that the US Air Force therefore provided this recording to the Russians. Now, I have to say, if that is so, then that would be an astonishing development. It would trigger, I would have thought, massive problems between Berlin and Washington, and it might create problems for all sorts of people in Washington itself. The US Air Force briefing the Russians against a NATO ally. Well, I don't know that it didn't happen, but all I will say is it stretches my capacity for belief. That's the first thing I'm going to say. The second thing, however, is that I do wonder if there was this, given that apparently, in fact, undoubtedly, it seems, there was this plan to capture this facility, this nuclear facility, nuclear weapons facility. I wonder whether just possibly this might explain some of the mystery about the departure of Victoria Nuland. One thing that a number of people have pointed out about Victoria Nuland's departure is that she herself has been completely silent since the announcement of her resignation a week or so ago. And maybe some significance in it or no significance in it. But it does seem to me strange that a person who has never hesitated to make her opinions clear, whether perhaps she's been told that she must remain silent if she wants work in Washington again. Just speculation. Anyway, put that aside, Victoria Nuland was travelling around Europe a few weeks ago before her sudden resignation. She visited Kiev. This was in the midst of the power struggle between President Zelensky and General Zaluzhny. She gave a rather what looked like an impromptu press conference. She said that the Russians should expect some nice surprises, that the Ukrainians had some nice surprises in store. Missile strikes on Russian territory, I suspect, were part of that. But one wonders, I do wonder now, Alex Christoforou on the Duran, in a program we did together, posed the very question whether one of the surprises was, in fact, an attack, this attempted incursion into Russian territory, whether Nuland had been briefed about this by the Ukrainians and had given her stamp of approval, or whether just possibly she played some role in coming up with this disastrous plan. Well, if so, and assuming, as I now do, that the plan did extend to capturing a Russian facility housing nuclear weapons, then I can very well imagine that some people in the Pentagon and the State Department would have been absolutely livid about this. And they might have said to themselves, this has gone altogether too far. She's taking absolutely appalling risks, and this might have been the single trigger which might have led to the demand that she had to go. Again, very speculative. I don't know. But to repeat again, the nuclear facility exists. There are nuclear weapons stored there. There's now an accumulation of people telling me that it was indeed the objective of the Ukrainians to capture this facility. The Russians clearly had some understanding of the Ukrainian plan and were ready for the Ukrainians. When they arrived, a source has told me that they obtained intelligence about it. Certainly President Zelensky appears to think so, and supposedly he's been briefed by Kirill Budanov, his military intelligence chief, who has told Zelensky that the only reason this whole operation miscarried in the way that it did is because the facts about it were leaked to the Russians, allowing the Russians to prepare themselves in advance. Well, there we go. I mean, I am not going to speculate about this. Others think that the Russians would have been prepared because it was not difficult to figure out that the Ukrainians were going to try something on the border during the election period. And besides, the Russians probably have all kinds of means of collecting intelligence in Ukraine, which might go beyond human agents. But returning to my main point, it does seem as if a plan to seize nuclear weapons did exist, and it does, and well, clearly it failed, and if that, all the assumptions about that are correct, well, that again tells us that we shouldn't breathe too easily, despite the fact that Macron's latest plan to send troops to Ukraine appears to have been called off. Well, I'm not going to discuss these issues further. I should say that I find it difficult to talk about use of nuclear weapons or seizure of nuclear weapons by either side, by any side. And this whole affair appears to me astonishing and beyond alarming. And I think that, in truth, it ought to be discussed more fully, but more openly, by Western governments who presumably know what was going on. One would like to believe that there's been phone calls to Kiev telling the Ukrainians to back off from doing things like this, but I doubt, to be honest, that there have been. Anyway, let's move on and discuss what President Putin himself has been saying about this latest incident, these attacks on the border. And yesterday, he addressed a meeting of his Security Council in Moscow. This is, as I've discussed many times, not just a body that deals with security and defense issues, but it's clearly the single most important political institution within Russia. It functions very much as Putin's, well, as Russia's highest council and as Putin's inner cabinet. And it's clearly involved in determining policy in all sorts of areas, not just security and defense related. But anyway, Putin convened it and he discussed the attacks on the border over the course of this meeting. In fact, the meeting was clearly called with that purpose. And I'm going to read the brief transcript of Putin's opening words, which the Kremlin has provided. It reads as follows. As you know, today the presidential election started in our country in accordance with the Constitution of Russia. To disrupt the election process and intimidate people, at least in the areas bordering Ukraine, the neo-Nazi Kiev regime has planned and is trying to carry out a number of demonstrative criminal armed actions. Now, before I proceed further, I would just like to go back to what Putin says about the Ukrainian government, how he describes it. He doesn't call it the Ukrainian government. He doesn't even call it the Kiev regime, an expression which already calls into question the Ukrainian government's legitimacy. He's now straightforwardly referred to it as the neo-Nazi Kiev regime. Now, given that that is so, I think we can now definitely say that at the very least, the Russian objective in this conflict is regime change in Kiev. Because referring to the government of Ukraine in that way effectively precludes negotiations with it on anything other than terms of its unconditional surrender. using that kind of language, especially in a country like Russia, about a government, well, it's about the strongest language you can use. And here we see Putin doing it in passing, but nothing that Putin says is said without thought. And of course, the Kremlin has provided us both with a recording, apparently, though I haven't heard it, and the written text, a transcript in which those words appear. Anyway, Putin then goes on to say, what in other words this regime in Kiev is primarily striking civilian residential areas in Russian territory. About 95% of the enemy missiles and shells are being destroyed by our air defense systems. Nevertheless, unfortunately, we still have civilian casualties. All of them and their families will be given every necessary support and assistance. These enemy strikes do not and will not go unpunished. Now, there's been suggestions that those words of Putin, these enemy strikes do not and will not go unpunished, refer to the entire operations that the Ukrainians have been carrying out over the last couple of days, not just the drone strikes, which is what Putin is talking about in these words, the drone strikes that the Ukrainians have launched across Russia, but the border incursions as well. I think if you parse his words carefully, you can see that Putin was specifically referring to the drone strikes, not the incursions. And it looks as if the Russians will retaliate to the drone strikes, and that suggests to me that over the next couple of days, weeks probably, major missile strikes by Russia on Ukraine will resume. But we'll come to that shortly. And anyway, Putin then goes on to say, in addition, starting March 12th of this year and until now, our adversary has made several attempts to enter and gain a foothold on our territory, mostly by using special units, foreign mercenaries, and support forces from the armed forces of Ukraine. They've carried out several subversive terrorist attacks, 4 in Belgorod direction and 1 in Kursk direction, with an aim of entering Russian territory and gaining a foothold on it. The enemy used the following forces and equipment: over 2,500 personnel, 35 tanks, and about 40 combat vehicles. Now that, to me, sounds like a brigade of troops deployed to carry out these attacks by Ukraine along the border, trying to break into the border and ultimately seize this nuclear facility, or failing that, at least to capture some border villages. And I've already said that the nuclear facility itself is defended by a Russian motorized rifle brigade. So we see that the Ukrainians do not have overwhelming superiority in this area, but nonetheless, this is a very substantial force indeed, and one would assume that the Ukrainians, having deployed a force of this size, a full brigade with 35 tanks, was at least expecting to capture 1 or 2 villages, even if the grander master plan to capture the nuclear facility proved beyond them. Anyway, Putin then goes on to say, that is to say, the Ukrainians did not achieve success in a single direction. They were rebuffed and forced to retreat or flee, to be more precise, with heavy losses. The adversary lost about 60% of its personnel and over 50% of its armoured vehicles. Now, I ought to say that what Putin is, of course, talking about is the report from the Russian Defense Ministry that the Ukrainians suffered 1,500 losses over the course of this operation. It's important to say that the Russian Defense Ministry has said that Ukrainian irretrievable losses, which is to say dead and severely wounded, were 500, not 1,500. But likely it's true what Putin says, if you believe the Russian Defense Ministry figures, which I do, that 60% of the personnel of this brigade have been killed, severely wounded, or wounded in some way, and are presumably unfit for fighting at this particular time. And then Putin goes on to say, as I said earlier, these militarily senseless and humanitarianly criminal actions were aimed at disrupting the elections for the president of Russia. And he then goes on to say further on that he's confident that the Russian people will remain united in the face of these attacks, and that the Russian armed forces are confidently holding the initiative and showing courage and heroism, fulfilling their combat missions. And he's in effect saying that these attacks will not affect in any way the stable internal situation in Russia. And then after Putin's comments, we're told that there was a presentation by Defense Minister Shoigu, but we've not been provided with it. So this is what Putin said. There's going to be a retaliatory strike against the drone attacks, so we can expect over the next couple of days a big Russian missile and drone strike across Ukraine. And at the same time, Putin is saying that all of the attacks on the border have so far been rebuffed, with the Ukrainians suffering very heavy losses. Now, Shoigu, after attending this meeting, then went off to the Rostov region, where he visited the headquarters of the Russian forces that are engaged in the special military operation, and received a briefing directly from the personnel there about what had taken place. I say that, I suppose it's possible that the briefing took place before, one way or the other, I don't know. Maybe it's the other way around. Maybe Shoigu went to the area, to Rostov, and received the briefing from the military first, and then went back to Moscow and briefed Putin at the Security Council. It could have been either way. Just noticing now, the Russian Defense Ministry doesn't actually tell us exactly when this meeting with the military leaders, Shoigu's visit to Rostov, actually took place. And we learn some rather interesting facts, that Shoigu held a meeting at the staff of the Joint Group of Russian Forces, where the minister was briefed on the current situation, the nature of enemy actions and performance of tasks assigned to Russian troops. During the briefing held by commanders, the Russian defense minister paid attention to reports about effectiveness of reconnaissance and attack weaponry, as well as counter-battery warfare. Chief of Staff of the Joint Group of Russian Forces, Colonel General Alexei Kim, reported that as a result of deployment of precision weapons and unarmed aerial vehicles, the enemy suffers great losses, both in manpower and hardware. Over the past week, As a result of reconnaissance and attack weaponry, 3 US-made Patriot systems, 1 Vampire multiple launch rocket system, more than 10 foreign-made artillery systems, and oil and ammunition depots were destroyed. And then we are told, very interesting piece of information, as a result of a precision aviation and ammunition strike at a temporary deployment area of the Kraken nationalist formation, up to 300 Ukrainian troops were eliminated. Now, the last strike we've not heard anything about up to this point, but the Russian Defense Ministry tells us that Colonel General Kim briefed Shoigu about it. So, this brings us back, this briefing brings us back to what is actually going on in the war. There were reports again this morning that the Ukrainians have renewed their attempts to break into Russian territory. And in fact, we've had a briefing about this from the Russian Defense Ministry, published this morning. It says as follows: attacks were repelled, Russian units inflicted losses on enemy manpower and hardware clusters in the border areas of Ukraine and Belgorod and Kursk regions. Attempts were repelled, and attempts by sabotage and reconnaissance groups of Ukrainian militants to infiltrate the territory of the Russian Federation were foiled on the side of Popovka, which is in Sumy region, to the north of this latest area of penetration, and in the direction of Spodoryushino and Kazinka, Belgorod region. As a result of aviation and artillery strikes, the Ukrainian losses amounted to 30 Ukrainian troops, 3 tanks, 2 armoured fighting vehicles, 1 Czech-made Vampire multiple launch rocket system, and 1 Grad multiple launch rocket system. So the Ukrainian attacks do seem to have resumed this morning, though this briefing from the Russian Defense Ministry suggests that it took place at a somewhat lower level of intensity than what we've seen over the previous days, with perhaps the Ukrainians now changing the focus of their attacks from Kursk and Belgorod regions to the north, with an attempted attack northward from the town of Vovchansk, in the area of the town of Vovchansk, in Kharkiv region, towards the further northern part of the Russian border. But anyway, if we go back to what Kim said to Shoigu, we learn that over the last week, the Russians destroyed 3 US Patriot systems. Now, we've up to now known that they destroyed two Patriot systems in this missile strike near Pokrovsk, where an entire Patriot complex was caught by the Russians and was destroyed by them. I discussed this in previous programs, but it seems that another Patriot system was destroyed, and there are reports circulating on the internet that this happened in Kharkiv region. So we see that the Russian campaign to destroy Patriot missile systems continues. And by the way, over the last few hours, there have been reports that another S-300 system has also been destroyed. Ukraine is being stripped of its air defense systems. But let's come back to this further report a temporary deployment area of the Kraken nationalist formation. This is, by the way, a famous or perhaps notorious far-right nationalist formation of the Ukrainian armed forces. Apparently, the Russians identified it and launched a strike against it, and the Russians say that 300 troops were eliminated. That could be killed or severely wounded, or perhaps the word eliminated might suggest that they were straightforwardly killed. This is a devastating strike, apparently carried out somewhere in Ukraine. We don't know exactly where. And it's curious because Kim's report to Shoigu is, as far as I know, the first confirmation that this attack has taken place. I don't doubt that it did, by the way, and whether the Russians have got the numbers of Ukrainian troops that they say were eliminated correct is another matter, but clearly some big, devastating strike did take place. And this brings me back to the strike that we have had reports about, which, to be clear, is a completely different strike from this one, the one on the Kraken unit. The one that's been widely reported in the media is the strike on Odessa. Now, I touched on it yesterday, but I hadn't appreciated the full nature of what happened. Apparently, the Russians got wind that an important military conference was underway in Odessa. Apparently, commanders of various Ukrainian brigades attended. Officers, senior officers also attended in Odessa. Clearly, this was some kind of a planning meeting. There are suggestions that it might have been connected with planning for this amphibious operation on the mouth of the Dnieper in the Kinburn Strait, a spit that we've been hearing an awful lot about. Others are suggesting that some operation towards Crimea might have been what was being planned here, or conceivably it could have been an operation connected in some way to the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. We simply don't know, and it's perhaps pointless to speculate. But a whole group of senior commanders were in one place, and they were in Odessa. And the Russians got wind of this, found out the location, and launched an absolutely devastating strike on the building in which this meeting was taking place. And we're getting reports that a lot of the participants in this meeting were either severely killed, severely wounded, or killed outright. And then, according to the Ukrainians, something further happened, because the Ukrainians say that after this building was attacked, ambulances and first aid and rescue workers were sent to the scene, and in what I believe is referred to as a double tap attack, horrible word, but anyway, in that kind of attack, even as these people were being extricated from the ground, these important people were being extricated from the ground, the Russians launched a second strike, killing even more of them. And according to the Ukrainians, many of the rescue workers as well, which would be tragic and perhaps illegal if it were true. Anyway, Zelensky is complaining about this, apparently in public. There is no doubt that this strike happened, and we're starting to get dribbles of information about the senior Ukrainian military officials who were apparently killed over the course of this strike. it does seem to have been a devastating affair. And what conclusion should one draw from all of this? Well, it seems to me that one clear conclusion is that the Russians are now getting an awful lot of intelligence about what is going on in Ukraine. They know where the Kraken unit is located. They know where the military people are holding confidential meetings. They're able to keep track of where the surface-to-air missile systems are, the Patriot missile systems are. They are able to anticipate locations where the Ukrainians are going to attempt to launch incursions of their territory. They're able to take immediate action in respect of all of this information that they are receiving. And that must be very alarming indeed to the Ukrainians, who undoubtedly must be figuring this out, and probably to the Ukraine sponsors, Western sponsors. There must now be quite significant levels of suspicion and even paranoia in Kiev, as they're probably on the hunt, trying to work out how the Russians are obtaining this information. And as I said, human agents might have played a role, electronic means might be playing a role, spy satellites, probably lots of different intelligence resources are being brought to bear simultaneously. But it's now clear that the Russians are able to keep track and see everything that's going on, or at least most things that are going on in Ukraine. Now, there is an alternative possibility, and this comes back to certain comments that I saw a senior Ukrainian officer give, apparently in a television interview. I'm taking this information again from Slavyangrad. Anyway, this officer said that what has actually happened is that the Russians have enormously improved their command, control, and intelligence systems. So that whereas earlier in the war, in the early months of the war, if the Russians obtained some battlefield information, it might take up to 6 hours before they put it to use and launched a rocket or missile strike based upon that information. So let's assume that the Russians found that the Kraken unit was located in one place. It might take them 6 hours before they would process that information, pass it on to the missile troops or the aviation troops, and before the strike against this location was launched. And by that point, of course, most of the Kraken troops might have left. And I think it is generally acknowledged that this was a weakness in the way in which the Russians were operating early on in the war. Over the long years of peace, the speed of their command and control system had slowed, and they weren't data processing effectively. Now, this Ukrainian officer says that things are very, very different, and that the Russians are able to obtain the intelligence, process it, and launch the missile strike within minutes. So perhaps that's what the true difference is. Maybe it's not that the Russians have cracked Ukrainian codes, implanted spies deep inside Ukraine's general staff, or achieved anything like that. Maybe they're obtaining the same quality of intelligence that they always have. It's just that they're able to respond to it far more quickly than they once could. Probably it's a combination of all of these things. Russian surveillance, intelligence gathering has improved significantly. I've discussed the fact that the Russians now have several satellites operating over Ukraine, keeping much more careful track of what the Ukrainians were doing than had been the case earlier in the war. And of course, no doubt, the drones, Russian drones, are much more active. And no doubt the Russians have been more successful in radio and other communications intercepts. Maybe the Russians also, this is a possibility, one should not overlook, have been able to break into the systems of some Western countries that have been obtaining intelligence information from Ukraine. Just saying. But probably it is also the case that the Russians are now able to respond to the information they do obtain far more rapidly and much more efficiently than had been the case at the start. And this is consistent with the overall story of a Russian military that has improved and developed markedly since the start of the special military operation, that is now far better equipped, better led, as the less successful commanders have been weeded out and replaced by more effective ones, better led, better trained, better coordinated, and much, much bigger. The Russian military is much stronger today than it was 2 years ago. And, well, we're starting to see more and more evidence of this on the battlefronts. And here I do want to discuss what is going on the battlefronts, because the news altogether continues to be very bad for Ukraine. Now, over the last week or so, most of the big news has come from places like Pervomaisky and Krasnogorovka, places north of Avdeyevka. Over the last 24 hours, it is different. It is coming again from the Avdeyevka area once more. And it is now not only confirmed that the Russians have reached the western outskirts, the western edge of Berdichi, the northernmost of the three villages, Berdichi, Orlovka, and Tonenka, which forms Ukraine's current defense line. But it seems that they have also captured most of the fields between Berdichi and Orlovka further south, and it looks as if they're also now in control of not just most of Orlovka, but also some of the fields to the south of Orlovka as well. And today we got further reports that the Russians have also gained control of more territory in and around Tonenka, the southernmost of these three villages. Now, I think it was yesterday that I said that there was reason to think that Syrskyi had deployed up to 9 brigades of the Ukrainian army to try to hold back the Russian advance in the Avdeyevka area. Well, according to the Russian Defense Ministry, it's not 9 brigades, as I assumed, but more probably as many as 11. We've had confirmation of this from the Russian Defense Ministry again. this came yesterday in the weekly summary of the fighting over the last week in Ukraine. And in connection with the fighting in Avdeyevka, the Russian Defense Ministry says this: in Avdeyevka, the center group of forces continues its advance and occupies more advantageous positions. In other words, they are advancing. And in cooperation with aviation and artillery, the Russian armed forces inflicted fire damage on manpower and hardware of 11 brigades of the armed forces of Ukraine near Ocheretino, Novzvelanoye, Novgorodovka, Rozovka, and Kalinovo. These, I believe, are all towns and villages west of these three villages, Berdichi, Toninka, and Orlovka, where the fighting is currently taking place. And the Russians go on to say, the defense minister goes on to say, over the past week, the armed forces of Ukraine have lost over 2,710 troops killed and wounded, 3 US-made Abrams tanks, we've discussed that already, 19 armoured fighting vehicles, 91 motor vehicles, and 18 field artillery guns in this area. So 11 brigades Syrsky has deployed to the Avdeyevka area, and despite that, the Russians are continuing to advance. So, just saying, this is a huge proportion of the Ukrainian army concentrated in this one area. It exactly mirrors what Syrsky did way back in this time last year, where again he concentrated an astonishing number of brigades. I seem to remember that at one point it was something like 25 brigades and big formations in the Bakhmut area as he tried to cling on, as the Ukrainians tried to cling on to that town. So, again, huge numbers of forces concentrated by the Ukrainians near to Avdeyevka. And nonetheless, despite this concentration of forces, the Russians, with their air force and their guns and their artillery and their tanks, are advancing. And as we see, Berdichi, Orlovka, Toninka, largely captured, the fields around them largely captured. Again, probably at some point fairly soon, the Ukrainians are going to be forced to pull back from these villages, and it seems that there isn't a clear defense line that they can fall back to, that there is a river obstacle which they will no doubt try to hold. But the Russians advancing in the south through the town of Pervomaisky, they're apparently around 2/3 of the way. They apparently now control around 2/3 of this town. If they capture Pervomaisky, which will become easier once the territory north of Pervomaisky and west of Avdeyevka falls under Russian control, which will probably happen over the next couple of days, week or so. Well, if the Russians are able to do that, they're well positioned to break the next Ukrainian defense line along this river obstacle from the south, through attacks from Pervomaisky to the northwest, and also by resuming their advance along the railway to the northwest of Avdeyevka towards Ocheretino, which I understand in this area represents the high ground. So, pressure increasing. Syrsky made the decision to try and hold the Ukrainians back along these three villages. He slowed them there. He's done this at the cost of very heavy losses, 2,710 troops, according to the Russians, over the course of the last week. The Russian Defense Ministry, incidentally, has added to that. They say that in the fighting in the Avdeyevka area over the last 24 hours, another 400 Ukrainian troops were lost. So this is an intense battle taking place all the time. And it does look as if Ukrainian defenses are not just cracking, but that the dam around Avdeyevka, which Syrskyi has tried to create, is about to burst. And I suspect the same is true further north in the Bakhmut area as well. Yesterday I spoke about how there were reports that the Russians had reached the Chasov Yar Canal to the southwest of Ivanyivska, which strongly suggests that the Russians now control all of Ivanyivska apart from its northwest corner. And there is apparently a telltale sign that sort of confirms that, in that it seems that the Ukrainians have published a film in which they repel an attack upon them by a Russian armoured column moving towards Klishevka to the south of Ivanyivska. And this particular armoured column seems to have come, Russian armoured column, seems to have come from the northwest, which again suggests that the Russians have moved beyond Ivanyivska. So quite plausibly, we're about to see the dam burst in the Bakhmut area as well. Now, we've had less news over the last 24 hours from Krasnogorovka and from Georgievka and from Novomikhailivka. But going back to what Putin said, it does seem as if the Russians have the initiative across the front lines. Putin said that they confidently hold the initiative across the front lines. And to be honest, I cannot see anything that can be done which will change this. So, another bad day for Ukraine and growing evidence of discord and disorganization in the West. And in the meantime, it remains the case that the further appropriation of aid for Ukraine appears to be stuck in Congress. I see no sign at the moment that the House of Representatives is prepared to vote on the appropriation for Ukraine. There's been more warnings from Biden administration officials that Ukraine's situation is becoming critical, that without the appropriation by Congress, the whole situation could collapse. The whole defense line in Ukraine could collapse sometime around the summer. But as I and many others have pointed out, it's not clear to me what this would change, this appropriation would change over time. And I'm going to say also that one of the things that we've been talking about a lot recently is the deployment of Western troops to Ukraine. And I think that one of the reasons for Macron's tantrum over the last 2 weeks or so is precisely because he is getting information from his military that Ukraine is now definitely on a trajectory towards total defeat. He's probably been informed, in fact, he definitely has been informed, that arms production by Europe cannot turn the situation round. He admitted in his press conference the day before yesterday that French industry is not capable of providing equipment at anything like the kind of rate that Russian industry can. And of course, the same is almost certainly true of European industry in total. So I suspect that this is what ultimately drove Macron's panic-ridden decision to start to push hard for deployment of European troops to Ukraine. The realization that the West simply lacks the resources to keep Ukraine funded and equipped so as to turn the situation round. And probably in his mind, he thinks that the only way that the situation could be rescued is if European troops went into Ukraine to try to hold the Russians back. Well, various people have written and discussed the poor state of the European militaries and the fact that they really are not in any kind of condition to take on the Russians. But perhaps there's been the most authoritative discussion of this in the Daily Telegraph by Edward Luttwak. Now, Edward Luttwak is one of these intellectuals, these military grand strategist intellectuals that the United States churns out. He is an extremely clever man. I won't pretend that I agree with many of the things that he says, because I emphatically don't. He was somebody who I remember back in the 1990s spoke out against NATO expansion at that time. So, he's sometimes, in fact, he very often gets things right, or at least, perhaps I should rephrase that. There are occasions when I find myself in agreement with him. But more often than not, when it comes to questions of grand strategy and planning and that kind of thing, I don't agree with him at all. But there's no doubt that he's well informed, and he does write about military matters in a well-informed way. And he talks about the state of the military in Europe. And of course, what he is taking on, and it's high time someone did that, what he's taking on is the myth that if European countries increase their defense spending and reach the 2% of GDP NATO target, that will somehow fix the problem. And Luttwak points out, this is simply not true. He says things like this: military spending is a very poor measure of each country's actual contribution to the military strength of the alliance. One major distortion is the almost universal practice of purchasing weapons from local manufacturers, regardless of their merits or unit costs. Italy is just now introducing its new NARP rifle, which is so advanced that it even sports an English name, New Assault Rifle Platform, which happens to be manufactured by Beretta, the private manufacturer that just happens to supply all the small arms of all Italian military and police forces. As Italy's own weapon aficionados immediately pointed out, there is nothing particularly novel about the NAP, which is not manufactured in the modern style, drastically shortened bullpup weapon with recessed barrel like the British SA-80 or Israel's Tavor, which actual combatants greatly prefer. I don't know whether that's true, by the way. That's what Litvak says. I don't get the sense that that is the case. But anyway, to move on. But going back to the NARP, is just another variant of Mr. Stoner's 60-year-old AR-15 that remains in US and global service as the M4. Except for the fact that the NARP costs 3 times as much. Altogether more expensive than Beretta's rifle monopoly in Italy is France's Dassault monopoly over all French combat aircraft, which produces beautiful designs at fabulous costs, not to speak of the warships made in very, very small numbers in every European country that has a navy of any size. And by the way, there have been more stories coming from Britain about the disastrous condition of the 2 aircraft carriers. There was a major fire on the Queen Elizabeth II aircraft carrier, and apparently there's talk circulating that this is an unlucky ship. But anyway, going back to Mr. Litvak, Poland, now praised for its increased military spending, is actually using a great deal of the money to become a Baltic naval power, complete with its own shipyards. For a country that faces an overland threat from Russia, with an army that is only now beginning to increase from absurdly low numbers, 42,000 soldiers when Ukraine was invaded, any sort of naval spending must be counted as a luxury, and more so in Poland's case, when it pays to build up shipyards rather than ships. I cannot even begin to calculate how much of Europe's defence spending should be deducted from its nominal contribution because it was non-competitively diverted from the cheapest available supplier to subsidise local industry and employment. But the amount in question must both be very large and yet nowhere near as consequential as the wide gap between nominal and actual combat capabilities in the ground, air and naval forces of most NATO members. Now, the point he's making is that a lot of defence spending in Europe is basically a job and money creation exercise. It provides employment and work for European companies producing very expensive weapons, whereas, of course, there would be alternatives which could be more cheaply obtained elsewhere. Now, elsewhere, of course, according to Litvak doesn't say this, is the United States. And those of us of a cynical view would point out that what effectively Litvak is telling the Europeans is to buy American, and of course he is himself an American, and no doubt somebody who wouldn't be sorry to see the American military-industrial complex roll in more profits. But you can take that cynical view, which I do, and still think that he is making a very good point. We see the enormous fragmentation of Europe's defence industries. And I'm going to say straightforwardly that I don't think anything can happen which will change it. The politics of doing this are impossible, and it will continue to result in every important European country, Britain, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, to some extent even smaller countries like Belgium and Austria, continuing to produce extremely expensive weapons in niche quantities. I forgot to add Sweden, by the way. In niche quantities, which will eat up a significant amount of the procurement budget. But then he goes on to say the second point he's making in this sentence is that putting aside the cost of all of this equipment and the question of whether much of this equipment is actually fit for purpose, there is a real question about the actual combat capabilities. In other words, the ability to fight of many European militaries. And he goes on to say this: all over Europe, there are infantry battalions, tank companies, artillery batteries, fighter bomber squadrons, and others such which all the required facilities and equipment for their respective roles, which mostly do a good job of looking the part, but whose one defect is that they have no actual combat capabilities, least of all against Russian forces. This is a harsh judgment, but not one that their informed compatriots are at all likely to challenge. I discovered as much when I posed the question to some European defence ministers. He has access to defence ministers in the wake of the failure of last year's Ukraine counteroffensive. Anticipating a future that had become very predictable, my question was simple. If supplying weapons, munitions and money to Ukraine is no longer enough, and NATO troops must be sent to stop the Russians, how many could your country send? The answer I received was uniformly 0, not presented as the result of any sort of strategic calculation, but simply as a matter of political inevitability. One minister put it very simply: if my government sends even one soldier to fight in Ukraine, it falls from power. When I noted that for once his government had a large parliamentary majority, he replied that his own centre-right party would vote against its leaders if any soldiers were sent to Ukraine. Next, I talked to some senior officers of that country. They candidly explained that the minister's political judgment was political, yes, but also mandated by cultural realities. There are some very small special units whose members might accept and perhaps even welcome a combat role, even in Ukraine, but apart from them, a few hundred at most, all other soldiers, though volunteers, would refuse to deploy to fight in Ukraine. It was not their fault, the officers explained, but merely a reflection of the prevailing and deeply rooted pacifism that would hold unless their country were actually attacked. Well, pacifism is a strong word. Perhaps I wouldn't use it myself in this context, but what Lutvak is saying is that there is no willingness on the part of many of the soldiers to actually deploy to Ukraine. There would be a major morale issue, and the minister of this country, I'm guessing we're talking here about Italy, though I can't be sure, the defence minister of this country, said straightforwardly, if there was an attempt to deploy troops by his country to Ukraine, the political reaction within the country would be so strong that the government would fall. And then Lutvak continues, the RAF bombing mission conducted against the Houthi targets in Yemen, executed by Eurofighter Typhoons operating from Cyprus, raised the question of what other European air forces might do. And he then doubts that they would have the ability to carry out such strikes. When I interviewed senior officers of two other air forces that also operate Eurofighters that told me that there was no chance at all that they would bomb the Houthis as the RAF has done. First, their governments would never send them to bomb the Houthis. Second, from Cyprus, it is a 3,000-kilometre operation there and back, and the needed aerial refuelling was rarely actually practiced and never so far from home bases. And Luttwak then goes on to say that for all its problems, the British military does still have a core of people who are prepared to fight, but the same does not apply for most of the rest of Europe. And I think this is true. Now, I have travelled around Europe a great deal. I've seen what many people in Europe think about war. I think it is all but inconceivable that Europeans would look happily to the prospect of soldiers from their countries being sent to fight the Russian army in Ukraine. Now, it's not just the Europeans who are starting to turn against, well, who are far from motivated to wage war. They would fight to defend their own countries, but they would be deeply unmotivated to defend Ukraine. Increasingly, it is Ukrainians themselves. There was a long article in the Financial Times discussing the recruitment crisis in Ukraine, and it said that a plurality of Ukrainian soldiers, of Ukrainian men of military age in Ukraine, 48% said that they would not be prepared to fight, as opposed to 34% who would, and 18% who refused to give an answer. So we see morale falling in Ukraine itself, and we see that in Europe, a perceptive and insightful man like Luttwak can see what to me is perfectly obvious, that neither the means nor the public will to go to battle with the Russians in Ukraine is there. Western leaders seem quietly to be coming to understand that the military production race with the Russians has been lost. Political leaders perhaps are starting to grapple with the reality that Ukraine is also running out of men, and that morale in Ukraine is falling, and we see that a plurality of Ukrainian men who've not yet been called up don't want to be called up and sent into the army to fight, and are not prepared for that to happen. They also have to start to face the fact that Europeans generically are not prepared to fight for Ukraine, and though I think that there is still significantly more of, well, what you might call a martial spirit in the United States than there is in Europe, I strongly doubt that Americans would be prepared to see their soldiers go to fight in Ukraine either. If Western governments do try to send troops to fight the Russians in Ukraine, they will face a political crisis at home. By contrast, in Russia, there is no shortage of volunteers joining the army every month, willing to fight. So, the conclusion again has to be that this is a failed enterprise. It is time that we put aside issues of face. Macron was talking about the fact that Europe's credibility would collapse to zero if the Russians win in Ukraine. Well, that may or may not be true. In fact, it almost certainly isn't true. But he's still ultimately talking about face. It is pointless seeking a victory. The time has come to face the fact and to inform the Russians that the West understands this, and to ask the Russians what their terms are. Putin, in his interview with Sergei Kislyak, made it, I think, quite clear that he's not interested in any terms that the West proposed. The right thing, it seems to me, given the situation, is to find out from the Russians what it is exactly that they want to see in Ukraine, and to see whether it might be possible for the West either to accommodate it or perhaps to persuade the Russians to compromise. Anyway, that's the end of my video today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and Twitter X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget to check out our shop, where we're also providing a whole lot of wonderful new things for St. Patrick's Day. And last but not least, if you like this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. More from me soon. Have a very good day.